For me, New York City had always been the escape, the shimmering promise beyond the dim horizon of rural Connecticut, where each day was a loop of muffled expectations and the slow, suffocating certainty that nothing extraordinary would ever happen to me. My name is Sam, and I had grown up with the unspoken assumption that my life was supposed to follow the template: school, college, job, maybe marriage if I got lucky, then some kind of bland middle age. Everyone around me seemed content to fold themselves into that mold. I wasn't. Or at least I told myself I wasn't. I wanted more. To be an artist, a writer, a name that mattered, to create something that outlasted me. New York had always loomed in my imagination as the place where it could happen, where reinvention wasn't just possible but inevitable. I thought if I could just get there, just carve out a small corner in the chaos, then the rest would follow. But the city doesn't care about your dreams. It doesn't even notice them. I was 22, working a dead-end job in a warehouse, my rent eating everything I made, my ambition draining away night by night in a cramped Brooklyn apartment that smelled like dust and fried onions. I'd begun to feel like I was dissolving into anonymity, like every person who passed me on the subway was another reminder that I was nothing, no one, just another hopeful kid being ground down by the city's machinery. So when I found the ad, it felt like a lifeline. A brownstone in Fort Greene. 1 room available. Rent so low it was almost a joke. The kind of rent that made you suspicious because nothing in New York was that cheap without some kind of catch. The woman's name was Eliza. She said she was a painter, working mostly on commission. Her emails were brief, not unfriendly but curt. The kind of responses that answered exactly what you asked and nothing more. Still, I didn't care about personality. All I saw was possibility. A way out of my collapsing apartment. A chance to live in a real space with character and history. When I met her for the tour, I thought she looked like someone who belonged to the city in a way I never could. Pale, with damp straw hair that hung around her face, she had the kind of presence that made you lean closer just to catch her words. She wasn't warm, but she wasn't unkind. She moved through the brownstone as though it recognized her, as though its creaking floors and shadowed corners were alive and deferential. The place itself was beautiful. High ceilings with intricate molding, exposed brick walls, polished wood floors that creaked with history. The living room had tall windows that let in bands of honeyed afternoon light. The kitchen was narrow but elegant, a strange mix of antique fixtures and modern appliances. But it was the studio that stunned me. It stretched across the back of the house, its ceiling pitched high beneath skylights angled to catch the shifting sky. The walls were lined with canvases, some finished, some half-born. The paintings were dark. At first they looked abstract, swathes of color clashing, heavy strokes, jagged shapes. But when you looked longer, patterns began to emerge. A jawline here, an empty eye socket there. Faces half submerged in shadow, expressions twisted in pain or fear. I told myself that was just her style. Artists trafficked in the strange. Still, something about the room lingered in me as I left that day. A faint pressure in the chest that I brushed off as nerves. A week later, I moved in. For the first few days, it felt like deliverance. My room was small but clean, the brownstone itself solid, dignified. The silence was almost luxurious after the constant racket of my old apartment. I told myself this was the fresh start I'd been waiting for. I'd come home from the warehouse, sit by the tall windows, and write for an hour or two, telling myself that if I could just get one thing published, the rest would unfold. But silence is never just silence. It changes as you live with it. At first it seemed protective, like being wrapped in a heavy blanket. Then it began to weigh on me. The apartment had no casual noise, no music, no laughter, no conversations drifting through the walls. Eliza never played anything, never watched TV. I'd hear her soft footsteps sometimes or the click of a mug on the counter, but otherwise the place felt like it existed in a vacuum. She was quiet too, almost eerily so. She emerged from her room only for tea, or sometimes slipped silently into the studio, She didn't ask me questions about myself, didn't volunteer information about her own life. When I tried to talk, her replies were clipped, polite, but her eyes always seemed elsewhere. I told myself she was just introverted, focused on her work. Her paintings grew darker after I moved in. Red began to seep into them, not bright crimson, but a dense, almost black shade, like coagulated blood. Shapes became clearer, torso-like, limb-like, faces twisted into screams. Once, I found her in the studio, just sitting in front of a blank canvas, staring at it as though it were speaking to her. When I said hello, she jolted as if she hadn't known I was there, her eyes wide before she smoothed them over with a faint smile. It unsettled me more than it should have. Nights were worse. The silence pressed in then, a thick thing that seemed to listen. The building made no casual sighs or hums, only sudden creaks that snapped me awake. One night, around 3, I heard it. A rhythmic dragging sound from Eliza's room. Deliberate. Something heavy being pulled across the floor, then paused, then dragged again. I sat upright, my heart pounding so hard it made me dizzy. The sound went on for minutes before it stopped abruptly. The next morning, I asked her lightly if she'd been moving furniture. She looked at me with a blank expression, head slightly tilted, then said in her flat, hushed voice, "It's just the pipes. They act up sometimes." She didn't smile. Her eyes didn't leave mine until I looked away. After that, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. When I came home from work, she was often in the studio, door open just a crack. Once, I caught her sitting in the shadows, staring directly at me as I entered, her face unreadable before she turned quickly back to her canvas. I laughed it off to a friend on the phone. "She's just weird. Artists are weird, right? I'll save money, get out eventually." But I didn't feel like laughing. The paranoia thickened day by day. At night, I began hearing faint sounds beyond my door, soft footsteps, pauses, as though someone stood listening. Once, I woke to find my door slightly ajar, though I was sure I had closed it. I told myself I was sleepwalking. But a deeper voice whispered that I wasn't. The turning point came when she was out one afternoon. I came home early from the warehouse, my body aching, my mind buzzing, and found her studio door slightly ajar. The room was dim, one lamp casting a pool of yellow light. A new canvas stood on the easel, and it was me. Not a vague resemblance, not a half-formed sketch. Me. My own face painted in uncanny detail, though distorted with terror. Eyes wide and hollow, mouth twisted open. Across my throat ran a thick red slash, jagged and deliberate. I staggered back, my breath tearing out of me. It was like seeing my own death frozen in oil and pigment. My first thought was insane. Maybe she'd found a photo online. But there was no denying the details, the slight crook of my nose, the uneven line of my jaw, the way my hair fell. She'd been watching me, studying me, painting me. I fled the room, my chest convulsing, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I called my friend Mark and spilled everything. He didn't laugh. His voice was sharp, urgent. "Sam, get out, right now, don't wait, don't argue, pack your shit and go." I didn't argue. I grabbed my laptop, passport, a few clothes stuffed into a bag, and left the rest behind. My hands shook so badly that the keys rattled against the door. I didn't look back as I fled into the street, convinced at every moment she would appear behind me, her hand cold on my shoulder. That night I slept on Mark's couch, unable to close my eyes without seeing the painting. My own face, frozen in fear. For weeks, I drifted through the city like a shadow, checking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I told myself I'd escaped, but the silence of that brownstone followed me like a stain. Then the news came. Local artist arrested for the murder of 3 men. The headline flashed on my phone one morning and the world tilted beneath me. I clicked the article with numb hands. The police had found bodies buried beneath the floorboards of a brownstone in Fort Greene. 3 men, all young, all vanished in the last 2 years. Each had been painted by the killer before their deaths, grotesque portraits discovered stacked in her studio. Her name was Eliza. Her photo stared back at me, her expression flat, her eyes cold. My vision swam as I read. The article mentioned her method. She painted them first. She captured them, as though the painting was the hunt before the kill. And I realized she had never once called me by my name. Not Sam, not anything. To her, I wasn't a roommate. I was already something else. I was prey. I wonder sometimes if the painting of me still exists, hidden somewhere in that house. My face contorted in terror, the red line across my throat. I wonder if she had already chosen the night, already planned the moment. They say she's in custody. They say the danger is over. But when I close my eyes, I feel that silence again, pressing in, alive. I see her sitting in the studio's half-light, staring at the canvas, waiting for me to come home. And I can't shake the sense that I never really escaped, because somewhere in oil and pigment, my death is already waiting for me. Atlanta, Georgia, in the humid, thick heat of summer, was the last place I wanted to be, but it was where I ended up when everything else collapsed. My name is Chris, and I was a musician, or at least I used to be. I'd spent most of my 20s crammed into vans and small clubs, playing to half-empty rooms, clinging to the illusion that one day the crowds would swell and I'd matter. Then the band imploded. The bass player quit mid-tour, the drummer overdosed, and the girl I thought I'd build a life with vanished in the night without even leaving me a note. By the time I staggered back to Atlanta, I had nothing. No band, no girlfriend, no money, no home. I was living out of my car, sweat pooling in the back seat as I tried to convince myself that I wasn't finished, that this wasn't rock bottom. I found the listing for the room in Decatur while scrolling through my phone in a McDonald's parking lot. It was cheap. Suspiciously cheap, and the pictures showed a sprawling old Victorian house with stained glass windows, high ceilings, and a kind of faded grandeur that made me think of museums more than homes. The owner, a man named Victor, answered on the second ring when I called. His voice was calm, precise, the kind of voice you associate with teachers or pastors. He said he was a retired professor living alone now, and he wanted company more than rent money. He told me to come by that evening. I drove over in the failing heat of dusk, sweat prickling at the back of my neck, the cicadas screaming so loud I had to turn up the radio. The house stood on a quiet, tree-lined street, set back from the road, its front porch sagging slightly but still dignified. The stained glass windows caught the last orange slant of sun, glowing like embers. I should have turned around right then. I should have driven back to my car and chosen the suffocating safety of its back seat over whatever lived inside that house. But desperation makes fools of us all, and I was already halfway up the porch steps before the thought even formed. Victor opened the door almost before I knocked. He was in his late 50s, tall, with thinning gray hair combed straight back. His face was narrow, sharp, the kind of face that looks like it's been carved by years of silence. His eyes were a pale, unreadable blue. He wore slacks and a tucked-in shirt, and he moved with a kind of deliberate neatness, as though each gesture had been rehearsed. "Chris," he said, extending a hand. His grip was dry, precise, and he smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Come in." The air inside the house was heavy, not with dust exactly, but with something else. Something sweet and faintly rotten, like fruit left too long on the counter. The ceilings arched high above me, stained glass windows filtering the light into strange colors. The living room was immaculate, sun pouring across polished wood floors, but it felt suffocating, like a mausoleum. I told myself it was just the heat. The room he showed me was large with tall windows and a view of the street. The rent was barely more than a token. He asked nothing of me except to respect the house and the quiet. I agreed on the spot. For the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. Victor kept to himself. He was quiet, respectful, almost invisible. Sometimes I'd catch him sitting in the living room, staring out through the stained glass at the street beyond, but he'd nod politely if I passed and say nothing more. The house was so still it was almost peaceful. I convinced myself I'd lucked out, that I'd found a way to breathe again. But small things began to gnaw at me. I'd come home from a shift at the coffee shop and find my mug in a different spot than I'd left it. The TV volume would be just a little lower. My shoes, which I'd left by the door, would be nudged half an inch to the side. At first I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I'd been careless, maybe I was just tired, but it kept happening. Subtle, tiny dislocations, as though the house itself was gently reordering my life. I told myself I was paranoid. I'd been sleeping badly, still raw from the breakup, from losing the band. My mind was reaching for patterns. But the house didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like it was watching me. One night I woke to a sound, a faint, rhythmic dragging, like something heavy being pulled slowly across a wooden floor. It came from Victor's room. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding so loud I thought it would wake him. The sound continued for long minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving the silence thicker than before. The next morning, over coffee, I asked about it. He looked at me, his pale eyes unreadable, and said, "It's just the pipes, they act up sometimes." He didn't blink. That was it. No elaboration, no chuckle, no acknowledgement of how strange it sounded. Just the pipes. After that, I started hearing other things. A whisper of movement when I walked past his door. The faint scrape of wood, like furniture shifting even when I knew he wasn't home. The smell grew stronger too. Rotten fruit. And sometimes beneath it something floral, like old perfume. It clung to my clothes, to my hair. At work I'd catch myself sniffing my shirt, embarrassed, wondering if customers could smell it too. I tried to avoid him, but he was always there. In the living room, in the hallway, standing just at the edge of where I expected him. He didn't do anything, just looked at me, polite, distant. Once late at night I passed him in the hall. I nodded. He didn't nod back. He just stood there, watching me walk away. The afternoon I made the mistake of stepping into his room. The air felt like it shifted. He was out, and his door was ajar, just enough to suggest carelessness. I pushed it wider. The room was disturbingly clean, almost sterile. The bed was unmade, but in a way that felt rehearsed. The pillows perfectly aligned, the blanket folded with precise, unnatural symmetry. There were no photographs, no books, no clothes on the floor, nothing that suggested a person lived there. It was a stage set for a life that didn't exist. I was about to leave when I noticed the notebook on the desk. A plain black book, unremarkable except for its presence in a room otherwise devoid of objects. I opened it. The words were neat, uniform, written in small block letters, dates and times. My name. Chris left for work at 8:15 a.m. Chris returned at 6:45 p.m. Chris ate chicken for dinner. Chris turned off the light at 11:10 p.m. Page after page, line after line, my life cataloged in exhausting detail. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I nearly dropped the book. I slammed it shut, fled to my room, grabbed a bag, and left the house without looking back. I drove until I found a cafe with fluorescent lights and the hum of other people. My hands shook as I called the police. I told them everything, the logbook, the sounds at night, the way my things were moved. They listened, but when they searched the house, they found nothing. No notebook, no evidence of intrusion. Just an odd, quiet man who, they told me, wasn't breaking any laws. They suggested a restraining order if he bothered me. Victor didn't. He simply disappeared. One day he was there, silent in the living room. The next, the house was empty. I left my things behind. I didn't care. I rented a small room downtown and tried to start over, though every shadow outside my window felt like him. But leaving didn't fix it. I'd wake in the night, convinced someone was standing over me. I'd hear faint dragging noises in the walls. I started second-guessing everything I did, Had I really left the window cracked, or had someone been inside? My co-workers noticed. They asked if I was okay if I was eating. I lied. A month later, scrolling through my phone on a break, I saw the headline: "Local man arrested in disturbing stalking and burglary case." The photo was grainy, but it was him. Victor. The article said he'd been breaking into homes, documenting people's lives in obsessive detail, sometimes for months, before eventually inserting himself into their routines. I felt sick. I couldn't finish reading. All I could think was how easily it could have been me. How I'd let him in. How I'd lived under his gaze without realizing it. Since then, every city feels like a trap. Every window gets double-checked. Every creak in the night feels like a footstep just beyond the door. I learned something I can't unlearn. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who look just like you, who wait quietly in the corners of your life until you stop noticing them. And sometimes in the quietest hours of night I hear it again, that faint rhythmic dragging coming from somewhere just beyond the walls. After my parents died, I stopped believing in permanence. That was the first thought I had when I stepped onto the porch of the old Victorian in Oakland, the wood beneath my shoes sagging like tired lungs. The house looked like it had been exhaling for 100 years, the paint peeling back in pale curls, shutters hanging crooked, the porch rails stained with water damage and time. It should have been condemned, I thought, but I was in no position to turn down a cheap room and a man who said he only wanted company. That word had a weight to it, didn't it? Company. As though being alone was a condition, an illness. Maybe it was. My name is Adam, and by the time I found myself standing on that porch, I had already become something of a ghost. The door opened before I could knock. "Adam?" The voice was calm, measured, almost theatrical. The man who filled the doorway was older, wiry, his skin loose on his bones, his hair gray but neatly combed. His eyes caught me off guard, not because of their color, which was an unremarkable pale blue, but because of how still they were, like water without current. "Yes," I said, shifting the duffel bag on my shoulder. "I'm Mr. Finch." He didn't smile. He simply stepped aside and gestured me in, as if the act of welcome was mechanical, a rehearsed movement. Inside, the house was suffocating. High ceilings, faded wallpaper with curling edges, stained glass windows that let in fractured colored light. The smell struck me hardest, something sweet that had gone rancid, like fruit left in a sealed container too long, mixed with an older, dustier scent, like antique furniture left in the rain. "You'll get used to it," Mr. Finch said, as if reading my mind. "Old houses hold on to their memories." That word, memories, stuck with me. He showed me my room upstairs. The floorboards creaked in long groans as we climbed, and with each step I felt as if the house were leaning in to listen. The room was small, but not terrible. A narrow bed with a sunken mattress, a dresser with chipped paint, and a single window overlooking the street. Outside, the neighborhood looked forgotten, as though all the other houses had been holding their breath for decades. "It's quiet," I said. "Quiet is good," Finch replied, his voice steady. "It means no one's watching." I laughed softly, unsure how to respond, but he didn't laugh back. That first night, lying in the strange bed, the smell of old wood and mildew clinging to the sheets, I thought about my parents. The accident had been quick, violent. A highway curve, a truck that didn't slow in time. My fear wasn't death. It was the erasure, the idea that their absence would soon become normal to everyone except me. That I too would fade into nothing, unnoticed, like pencil erased from a page. Maybe that's why the house didn't repel me the way it should have. It was a mausoleum, and I was already halfway buried. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. Finch was polite in a distant, meticulous way. He cooked bland meals, read in the living room, and went to bed early. He never asked me questions, never pried. The silence of the house stretched out like a heavy blanket. I worked a dull job downtown answering phones for a logistics company, and each night I returned to the house's stale air, its creaking timbers, and its steady silence. But then came the small things. One evening I noticed my coffee mug sitting on the counter in the kitchen, when I could swear I'd left it on the table. Another night, the TV was on, but the volume was one notch lower than I'd set it. They were insignificant changes, things anyone could dismiss. And yet, each detail landed like a pinprick, reminding me of my own fragility, my own tendency to question memory. "Did you move my mug?" I asked one night at dinner, more to break the silence than anything. Finch looked up from his plate, chewing slowly, then swallowing with deliberate effort. "No." His eyes lingered on me, unblinking, and something in his expression unnerved me. Not the words, but the absence of reaction, the stillness. "Must have been me," I said quickly. That night I lay awake listening. Around 2 a.m, a sound stirred me from the edges of sleep. A rhythmic noise, faint but steady, like something dragging across the floor. I froze, my heart thudding hard against my ribs. It came from Finch's room, a muffled scrape, pause, scrape, pause. I pressed my ear to the wall. The sound continued for several minutes, then stopped, leaving a silence so deep it rang in my ears. The next morning, over eggs and toast, I asked, "Did you hear something last night? Like the pipes?" Finch set down his fork, tilted his head slightly, and said, "It's just the pipes. They act up sometimes." His tone was flat, rehearsed, like someone repeating a line too many times. Days later, while Finch was out, I wandered the house. It had a strange geometry, rooms that didn't line up the way they should, hallways that seemed slightly too narrow, ceilings that seemed to bow. I came to his room. The door was ajar. For a long moment, I stood there, my pulse loud in my ears. Then I pushed it open. The sight was stranger than anything I'd imagined. The bed was unmade, yet the pillows were aligned with perfect symmetry. The blankets folded and refolded with unnatural precision, edges sharp as if measured. The room was sterile, devoid of any personal effects. No books, no photos, no clothes tossed carelessly. Just a bed, a desk, and a chair. It didn't look lived in, it looked staged. On the desk sat a small notebook. I shouldn't have opened it. But curiosity, dread, and some need for proof drove me. The handwriting inside was tight, neat, and every line was about me. Adam left for work at 8:15 a.m. Adam returned at 6:45 p.m. Adam ate chicken for dinner. Page after page, a detailed log of my movements, my habits, the minutiae of my life recorded with surgical precision. My stomach turned cold, a wave of nausea rising. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair, and fled the room. I stuffed my essentials into a bag, heart hammering. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker, as though the house itself didn't want me to leave. At a cafe a few blocks away, I called the police. I told them everything. His room, the notebook, the sounds in the night. They investigated, but when they returned my call, they said they'd found nothing. No notebook, no evidence. Just an eccentric older man in an old house. They told me I could file a restraining order if he bothered me again, but he didn't. He disappeared. For weeks, the house stood silent. Then I moved out, found a cheap apartment across town. I tried to forget, but forgetting wasn't possible. Not when a month later I saw a headline on my phone. Local man arrested in disturbing stalking and burglary case. The article described a man who infiltrated lives, who logged every detail of his victims, who broke into homes with uncanny precision. His name was Mr. Finch. The nausea returned, sharper this time. It could have been me. I had let him into my life, into my silence, into my fear. Now every city feels temporary. Every window, every door is checked twice before bed. I tell myself I escaped, but the truth is murkier. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint sounds outside my apartment. The scrape of something dragged across a floor, the almost imperceptible shift of air in a room that should be empty. And sometimes, When I wake suddenly in the dark, I could swear there's a notebook resting on the table beside my bed waiting to be opened. Because the most dangerous people aren't the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who look just like you, who slip into your silence and make a home there until you can't tell if you ever lived alone at all. Boston in the dead of winter is a study in bleakness, the kind that seeps into your skin and gnaws at your bones, not because of the temperature, but because the world itself seems drained of color, like everything around you has surrendered to some gray inevitability. My name is Mark, and I used to work in finance before I was laid off, but that feels like another lifetime now, some half-remembered identity that belonged to a person stronger than I am. After losing my job, I spiraled. No, I collapsed, fell into this suffocating fog where every morning felt like I was clawing my way back from the edge of a black pit. I spent my days stretched out on the couch of my tiny South End apartment, staring at the ceiling, barely eating, drinking too much cheap whiskey, the silence around me so complete it became its own kind of noise. My phone buzzed now and then, old co-workers or friends checking in with polite half-concern, but their voices sounded distant and I didn't answer. I was broke, out of work, and running out of excuses to myself. It was only when my savings shrank to a number that made my stomach churn that I realized I had to either leave the apartment or find a roommate. The idea of sharing my space with someone terrified me more than eviction. I wasn't afraid of loneliness. It had become my shield, my justification. What I feared was being seen. I was ashamed of the hollow person I had become. The thought of someone glancing at me across a room and knowing, just knowing, that I was a failure, it was unbearable. And then I saw her listing, a room in a brownstone in the South End. Owner seeks quiet tenant, references preferred. The ad was polite, almost old-fashioned. I called and her voice was soft, even tentative when she answered. Eleanor, she said her name was. Retired librarian, early 60s, living alone. She wanted company more than rent money. That sounded perfect. When I arrived, the brownstone was exactly what I'd imagined. A grand, fading relic of another century, with high ceilings, crown molding, exposed brick walls, tall windows that spilled pale winter light into the living room. It felt dignified, serene, the sort of place where someone could retreat from the chaos of the city outside. Eleanor herself was small, gray-haired, with eyes that seemed to flicker between warmth and distance like candlelight seen through glass. She wore cardigans, sensible shoes, and moved with a quiet precision that suggested she'd spent her life in orderly spaces. She asked me almost nothing about myself, which was a relief, and told me she just wanted someone steady, respectful, someone who could treat the house kindly. I signed the lease the next day. At first, it was as easy as I'd hoped. Eleanor was quiet, polite, the kind of housemate you could forget was even there. She spent most of her time in her room, and when she wasn't, she sat in the parlor with a book. Her voice was always measured, and her smile, when it appeared, was fleeting, almost embarrassed, as though happiness were something she had no right to display too openly. I told myself I'd lucked out. The apartment itself, though beautiful, carried something I couldn't name. The rooms were always cold no matter how high we set the thermostat, and a faint smell hung in the air, a cloying mix of rotting fruit and old perfume that made me think of forgotten basements and thrift store bins. Still, I dismissed it. Every old house had quirks. It was the little things that unsettled me first. I'd leave my coffee mug on the counter, only to find it later in the sink. The TV volume, which I always kept at 15, would be at 14 when I returned from work. Once my jacket, which I draped over the back of a chair, appeared neatly folded on the sofa arm. They were small intrusions, easy to rationalize, but I couldn't shake the sense of being studied. My routines not just noticed but memorized. One night, just as I was drifting to sleep, I heard it. A faint rhythmic sound from Eleanor's room. A dragging noise, steady, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My heart seized and I lay rigid in the dark, listening. It went on for what felt like minutes before stopping abruptly. The silence afterward was worse, charged, as though the air itself had been disturbed. In the morning, I asked, awkwardly, if she'd been moving furniture. Eleanor blinked at me with eyes that seemed too still, too deep, and said in her calm, flat way, "It's just the pipes. They act up sometimes." Her answer didn't sit right, but I let it go. That was the beginning of my insomnia. I'd lie awake listening, waiting for the faint scrape or shuffle beyond the wall, for the sigh of floorboards bending beneath weight. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers, too low to make out words, just a cadence, as though she were reciting something. My mind began to spiral, doubts multiplying like cracks in ice. Was I imagining it? Was I becoming paranoid? Curiosity is dangerous. One afternoon, while she was out, I drifted toward her room, telling myself I'd just glance inside, nothing more. The door was ajar. I pushed it gently and froze. Her bed was unmade but meticulously arranged, the pillows perfectly aligned, the blankets folded with geometric precision. It was unsettling, the kind of neatness that felt clinical, compulsive. The room was sterile, stripped of personality. No photographs, no knickknacks, no signs of a life lived there. Just furniture, stark and functional. I turned to leave, but a small black notebook on the desk caught my eye. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Inside, my breath caught. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dates, times, and details. My details. Mark left for work at 8:15 a.m. Mark returned at 6:45 p.m. Mark ate chicken for dinner. Mark watched television until 10:30 p.m., volume at 15. Mark coughed twice before bed. My stomach knotted, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't just observation, it was surveillance, cataloging me with unnerving precision. My hands trembled as I dropped the book and bolted from the room. I packed a small bag in minutes, barely thinking, just moving. Fear had taken over. I fled the brownstone, my breath steaming in the frigid air, and ducked into a nearby cafe, hands shaking so badly I spilled coffee down my sleeve. I called the police, told them everything in a rush. Her watching me, the notebook, the noises at night. They listened but were unimpressed. When they went to the apartment, they found nothing. No logbook, no signs of a crime. Just an odd, lonely woman living quietly. They told me almost impatiently that if she bothered me, I could file a restraining order. That was all. But Eleanor didn't bother me again. She disappeared. One day she was there, the next she was gone, and the brownstone stood hollow, its windows dark. I moved out, of course. I told myself I was free. But weeks later, scrolling through the news on my phone, I saw the headline, "Local man arrested in stalking and burglary case." The article described how he insinuated himself into people's lives, meticulously documenting their routines before breaking in. His name, his real name, was Eleanor Blackwood, a man who had hidden in plain sight, wearing the quiet mask of an elderly woman. Reading that, I felt sick, as though the floor beneath me had dissolved. I thought about the notebook, about the dragging sound in the night, about his eyes, those empty, watching eyes. I had let him in. I had invited him into my life. Since then, I can't sleep without checking the locks 3 times. Every city feels temporary, unsafe, as though I'm never really home. I still wake in the night, certain I hear the drag of something heavy across a floor, and I lie rigid, listening, waiting. Because what I learned is this: the most dangerous monsters don't hide in shadows. They don't wear fangs or claws. They wear cardigans, offer polite smiles, and look just like anyone else. And once they've seen you, really seen you, you can never unsee them. London in January is a bitter, unforgiving city, where the wind doesn't merely cut through you but seems to strip away pieces of your resolve. The streets stretch out like veins of gray stone under a sky that never brightens, and the cold presses in with a weight that makes you want to stay inside forever. My name is Daniel, and at the time, I had been hollowed out by loss. After a messy divorce, I had almost nothing left. My home was gone, the rhythm of my days fractured. The quiet comfort of routine ripped away. My severance package from my last job was thinning by the week, and the humiliating possibility of moving back in with my parents loomed closer. I needed space of my own. Not just four walls, but a place where I could start breathing without someone else's expectations shaping my every move. When I saw the listing for a 2-bedroom apartment in Notting Hill, it seemed like a way out, a rope thrown into the pit. Spacious high ceilings, a small garden, and a rent I might manage if I had someone to split it with. But there it was. The condition. A flatmate. That word carried weight I didn't want to feel. After my divorce, I'd sworn to live alone, swaddled in solitude, where no one could interfere with me again. The problem wasn't loneliness. I could endure that. What I feared was the presence of someone else in my space, the memory of my ex-wife still sharp, her voice still in my head telling me which shirt to wear, how much salt to sprinkle, why my friends weren't good for me. She had managed every detail of my life, and though the divorce had left me broken, it had also freed me from that control. I wasn't eager to hand the reins back to anyone. Still, the rent was cheap. Too cheap. A voice in the back of my mind warned me there had to be a reason. I combed through replies until I found Leo. His message was brief, almost blunt. Freelance programmer, quiet, value privacy. He didn't gush about being tidy or laid back. He didn't pretend to be funny or outgoing. He wrote like a man who had no interest in putting on a show. That appealed to me. When I met him, he was unassuming, dark hair that fell slightly into his eyes, a posture that seemed both weary and cautious, as if he were careful about how much space he allowed himself to take up in the world. He asked me almost nothing. He smiled once faintly when I offered him tea, and when I said the most important thing was respecting each other's space, he said quietly, "That's all I want too." We signed the lease. The apartment became ours. At first, it was better than I'd dared to hope. Leo moved like a ghost through the flat. Quiet, unobtrusive, respectful. I hardly ever saw him. Sometimes I wondered if he had friends, a family, a life beyond these walls, but I didn't dwell on it. His absence suited me. Days slid into weeks, and I began to think I'd been lucky, that maybe the universe had decided to cut me a break after all. But unease has a way of seeping in slowly, like water finding cracks in stone. The first signs were small enough to brush off. A mug of mine slightly off its usual spot. The TV volume one notch lower than I remembered leaving it. My coat folded in a way I didn't recall. Nothing conclusive, nothing sinister, but each detail clung to me, gnawed at me, whispering that something wasn't aligning the way it should. I told myself I was imagining things. Divorce and displacement had left me raw, maybe paranoid. It was easy to believe I was projecting old fears onto harmless quirks. But then came the night I woke to that sound. It was faint at first, distant through the plaster walls, but it tightened every nerve in my body the instant I recognized it. Something dragging slowly across the floor of Leo's room. A scrape, pause, scrape again. It went on with unsettling rhythm, like a heartbeat made mechanical. I lay rigid in the dark, my chest burning with the effort of holding my breath, each movement of that unseen object setting my imagination on fire. And then silence. Not relief, but silence heavy enough to make the air feel thicker. The next morning I asked, casual, trying not to betray the tremor in my voice. "Hey, I heard something last night. Sounded like something moving across the floor. You working on something in there?" Leo's eyes fixed on me, flat as slate. "It's just the pipes," he said. His tone was level, but it was the kind of level that admits nothing, that invites no further questions. "They act up sometimes. Pipes don't scrape like that. Pipes rattle. Pipes groan." But I nodded anyway, because what else was I supposed to do? After that, I noticed more. His door was always closed, always locked when he wasn't inside, except one afternoon. He must have left in a hurry because it was slightly ajar. I knew I shouldn't go in. Boundaries matter. But something stronger than curiosity pulled me across that threshold. The room felt wrong. The bed unmade, but the pillows aligned with eerie precision. The blanket folded back with unnatural exactness. The space itself was sterile, devoid of life. No books, no photographs, no sign of hobbies or warmth. It was less a bedroom than an exhibit of one. That's when I saw the notebook. It lay open on the desk, innocent in appearance, and yet the sight of it filled me with dread so strong it made me dizzy. My hands shook as I picked it up. Each page was filled with lines of neat, steady handwriting, dated entries, observations. Daniel left for work at 8:15 a.m. Daniel returned at 6:45 p.m. Daniel ate chicken for dinner. My name, my life, documented in clinical detail, page after page after page. The air seemed to collapse around me. My heart hammered so hard I thought I might faint. I dropped the notebook, stumbled backward, and fled. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just grabbed a bag, stuffed it with whatever I could in seconds, and ran out into the cold. At the cafe down the street, I dialed the police with shaking fingers. I told them everything, every detail. They listened. They said they would investigate. Later, they told me there was nothing criminal about keeping a notebook. Nothing to hold him on. Leo vanished. His things disappeared overnight, as though he'd been a mirage. And yet he didn't vanish from me. His absence filled the apartment with something more suffocating than his presence ever had. The silence no longer felt like mine. It felt like something watching me, waiting. Weeks later, I saw the article. Local man arrested for stalking and burglary. His face stared back at me from the screen. Leo Blackwood. He had stalked others the same way, documenting every detail of their lives, stepping closer and closer until he took more than observation allowed. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt sick, because I had let him in. Even now in new apartments in new cities, I check the locks over and over, windows sealed tight, curtains drawn. Still, I can't shake the sense of being studied. Sometimes I catch myself listening for it, that faint rhythmic sound. Scrape, pause, scrape again. And in the moments before sleep claims me, I wonder if Leo really disappeared at all, or if he simply moved to the corner of my life that light never touches. The most dangerous people are never the ones who look like monsters. They are the ones who look like you, like me, like anyone. And late at night when the world is still, I sometimes hear it again. The sound of something dragging slowly, patiently across the floor. The heat in Los Angeles is a living thing, a weight that presses against the skin and crawls into the lungs. But in the summer of 2017, I barely felt it at all. The heat was nothing compared to the burn of betrayal that already hollowed me out. My name is Alex, and I was 20 that summer, raw from a breakup that had gutted me more than I wanted to admit. Lucas, my Lucas, had left me for someone I'd trusted more than anyone, my best friend. It was the kind of betrayal that doesn't just break your heart. It unthreads the fabric of how you see the world. It felt like the universe had turned inside out, and I was the one left spinning, clutching scraps of something that used to be my life. I told myself I needed a reset, and that's what I thought I was doing when I moved into that little stucco building in Echo Park. The apartment wasn't much. 3rd floor, beige walls, narrow hallways that always smelled faintly of bleach. But it was mine, or at least it could be if I found someone to split the rent. I didn't have the luxury of pride anymore, so I put out an ad. That's how Connor walked into my life. I remember the first time I saw him. He showed up carrying a worn-out duffel bag, his sneakers dusty and his shirt clinging from sweat. He was tall, but his frame was wire-thin, like someone who hadn't been eating right for a long time. His grin was practiced, and his eyes, I don't even know how to describe them. Too restless. They moved like insects skittering across a plate. I knew immediately that something was off. Every nerve in my body warned me against him, but desperation does strange things to your judgment. He told me he'd just moved from Arizona, that he was a graphic designer looking for a fresh start. A fresh start. That phrase always sounds like a promise, but from his mouth it sounded like a cover story. Still, I signed the lease with him. We moved into a rhythm that first month, or maybe it would be more accurate to say we moved around each other. Connor kept mostly to himself, disappearing during the day, and when he was home, he shut himself in his room. I told myself it was ideal. Privacy, boundaries, no drama. But the silence of the apartment carried a kind of weight, like something coiled tight just out of view. It started with little things. A smell that lingered long after he came home, bitter and chemical, almost like rubbing alcohol but spoiled somehow. A faint metallic tang in the air near his room that I couldn't trace. He'd say things that brushed against cruelty, delivered with a smile that was almost too friendly. When I landed a new job at a coffee shop, he leaned in close one night and muttered, "Guess you're really living the dream, huh?" The words weren't harsh on their own, but the way he said them made my skin prickle. His voice had a low vibration in it, like he was suppressing a laugh that never came. And then there was the record player. My grandmother's antique, one of the only things I cared enough to bring when I moved out. I hadn't touched it since the breakup. It carried too many memories. One night I came home, dropped my keys, and froze. The player was sitting in the middle of the living room, a record spinning lazily, its needle dragging out a warped, wavering sound. But it wasn't one of my records. I didn't even recognize the music. Connor was sitting on the couch, legs stretched out, staring at the spinning vinyl. "I thought you liked it," he said. Just like that, no explanation of how he'd found it or why he'd set it up. I tried to shrug it off, but from that night on, the apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. It was like the walls had absorbed his presence, reshaping themselves to his design. Sleep became impossible. Sometimes I woke to the sound of his door creaking open in the middle of the night, followed by silence that stretched too long. I would lie there holding my breath, waiting for his footsteps, but they never came. Just silence, thick and oppressive, until I eventually passed out from exhaustion. One night I woke to a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was outside, maybe someone knocking against the pipes, but when I sat up and strained to listen, I realized it was coming from inside the walls. Slow, deliberate taps, like someone was tracing a path with their fingers just on the other side of the plaster. I stared at the wall for hours, convinced I'd see it bulge inward. I confronted Connor the next morning. "Have you heard anything from the walls?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked at me, a smirk twitching at his mouth. "Yeah, sometimes. You'll get used to it." That was all he said. From there, the unease bled into everything. I couldn't tell if it was him or me or the building itself. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to look strange, subtly altered, as though the person staring back wasn't entirely me. My coworkers at the cafe noticed I was distracted. One of them, a girl named Elise, asked if I was okay. I lied and told her I just wasn't sleeping. But the truth was, I was unraveling. I caught Connor watching me sometimes, his head tilted slightly, his eyes sharp and unblinking. Once, I walked into the kitchen to find him standing completely still, facing the wall. He didn't move when I came in, didn't acknowledge me at all. Just stood there breathing, shallow and rhythmic, until I backed out and shut myself in my room. The breaking point came one Wednesday evening. I came home after a late shift, exhausted and jittery from too much caffeine. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light. Connor was standing there, his back to me, but as soon as I dropped my bag, he turned, his face was blank, hollow. "Did you hear that?" he asked. His voice was low, hushed, almost reverent. "Hear what?" I tried to sound steady, but my voice shook. "The scream," he whispered. "Someone's in here." Every hair on my body stood on end. I froze, listening. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge. He took a slow step toward me, his eyes wide. "They don't want you to know, but they're here." I bolted for my room, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were trembling as I dialed 911. I could hear him moving through the apartment, his footsteps dragging, deliberate, like he was pacing the perimeter of my door. When the police finally arrived, they found nothing. Connor acted confused, polite even, as though I'd overreacted. The officers gave me a look that said I was wasting their time. "Probably just a prank," one of them muttered as they left, but I knew better. I didn't wait to pack. That night I stuffed a backpack with essentials and left, abandoning the apartment, my furniture, even the record player. I couldn't breathe until I was miles away. 2 months later, I got a call from my old landlord. He told me the new tenant, a young woman, had been complaining. The same things I had. Strange smells, sounds from the walls, the feeling of being watched. I felt a wave of nausea, cold and dizzying. I told him everything, about Connor, about the tapping, about the scream. He said he'd look into it. I never heard from him again. Sometimes, late at night when the world is too quiet, I think about that apartment. I picture Connor standing in the kitchen staring at me with those restless eyes, and I wonder if he was ever just a man at all, or if he was something else, something older, something that feeds on cracks in people's lives, sliding in when we're most vulnerable. Some nights I swear I can still hear it. The faint tapping in the walls, patient and deliberate, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in Echo Park, behind a stucco facade and a locked third-floor door, Connor is still there, waiting for someone new to walk through. Toronto, with its glittering towers and endless ambition, had promised me a fresh start. But even on that first night when I stepped off the bus and dragged my single battered suitcase across the wet pavement, I felt something uneasy in the air. The city was noisy, sirens, clattering streetcars, the buzz of late-night traffic. But it wasn't the sound that unnerved me. It was the silence that came between those sounds. The spaces lingered too long, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. My name is Julian, and at the time I thought I understood what I wanted. Privacy, distance from the chaos of New York, a quieter rhythm. What I didn't understand was that sometimes silence isn't peace at all. Sometimes silence is the sound of something waiting for you to notice it. I had left New York burnt out. Photography had once been my obsession, my escape. But in that city, every image felt like an entry into a war I didn't have the stomach for. Clients demanded more and more for less. Colleagues were competitors who circled like sharks. And then there was Mia, my ex. She was a social media influencer, bright, charming, relentless. Our relationship had felt like a series of photographs staged for her audience. Morning coffee with the right filter, studio shots of me working, fake candid smiles at parties. I had become an accessory, not a partner. When it ended, I felt hollow, like I didn't exist outside of her feed. So I left. Toronto seemed far enough, foreign enough, to build myself again. The Kensington Market loft I found was everything I thought I wanted. Exposed brick, tall windows, the vibrant chaos of the market outside. Color, sound, and life, but still my own space, uncurated and unobserved. It was too expensive, but I told myself it was an investment in sanity. I lasted a month before reality cornered me. A client pulled out of a project at the last second. My savings bled faster than I could staunch them, and suddenly I was staring at my dwindling account. 3 weeks, maybe 4, before the city spat me out. Unless I found someone to share the rent. I didn't want a roommate. The word itself felt like failure. But when a friend mentioned someone, Ethan, quiet, late 20s, worked in a data center, I forced myself to listen. Privacy had been my craving. What better than someone equally private? He moved in on a gray afternoon, carrying one plain suitcase. He shook my hand once, thanked me, and disappeared into his room. I remember standing in the hallway after the door shut, relieved by the silence. Finally, a balance. Companionship without intrusion. Sophie was the first to raise doubts. She was the only part of New York I hadn't cut away completely. Not a girlfriend exactly. We drifted in and out, tangled in history neither of us wanted to name, but she visited often. One night she glanced at Ethan's closed door and whispered, "He doesn't eat with you? Doesn't talk?" I shrugged. "He's private. That's the point." She smirked. "Or creepy." I told her not to judge. Truthfully, I preferred Ethan's silence to the chaotic roommates I'd had before. For a while, it seemed like I'd found perfection. The first disruption was small. My bedroom door was open one morning, not wide, just cracked enough for someone to look in. I locked it every night, a habit born from living in crowded apartments in New York. But that morning, the latch was undone. I told myself maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe Sophie had opened it. But the unease clung to me. Then my camera. My Leica. The one expensive possession I carried from New York. The tool I loved and hated. Was on my desk with its lens cap off. I never left it that way. Light poured through the window, glinting on the glass, and I felt exposed, as though the lens had turned on me. I asked Ethan, careful to sound casual, "You didn't touch my stuff, did you?" He looked up from his laptop, his pale eyes flat, unreadable. "Maybe you forgot." His tone was neutral, almost polite, but the word "maybe" lodged in me like a splinter. The weeks bled together in quiet paranoia. A mug left in the wrong place. The faint scent of my cologne in the hallway when I hadn't worn it. One afternoon, I opened my door to find Ethan in the kitchen, standing perfectly still, his head tilted toward my room as though listening. When I stepped out, he straightened and smiled. "We out of milk?" he asked, as though nothing were strange. His timing was perfect, too perfect, as if the question had been rehearsed. I told myself I was imagining things, building ghosts from silence. But then came the night of his laptop. I had returned late with Sophie, laughing as we stumbled up the stairs, her hand in mine. Ethan's door was ajar, blue light spilling into the hall. I glimpsed the screen before he shut it. Photographs. Me, Sophie, asleep in my bed. The angle was impossible, higher than the doorframe, from inside the room. When I confronted him, my voice tight with rage and fear, he didn't flinch. "I like to capture moments," he said. "It's a habit." His smile was almost apologetic, but his eyes didn't change. They were cold, glassy, like something watching through him. I wanted to throw him out. Sophie begged me to, but the rent, the police's inevitable uselessness, my own fear of escalation, they all pressed me down. I told myself to wait, but silence, I learned, decays. It rots. The loft no longer felt like mine. Shadows lingered longer in corners. The light bulbs dimmed when Ethan walked by. I stopped sleeping deeply. Every sound, the radiator's hiss, the building's creak, stretched into menace. One night, near midnight, he knocked on my door. The sound was soft, hesitant almost, but when I opened it, his expression was calm. "What's the best way to get a secret out of someone?" he asked. My heart lurched. I don't know, I said. His smile widened, but only his lips moved. His eyes stayed hollow. "You will," he whispered. I pushed my oak dresser against the door after that, though I knew it wouldn't matter. He had a spare key. I sat up until dawn, every sound amplified, convinced I heard breathing on the other side of the door. When I checked, the hallway was empty. The next morning, he made eggs in the kitchen, humming tunelessly, as though nothing had happened. I couldn't stay. With my camera bag slung over my shoulder, I climbed down the fire escape, the iron freezing under my hands, and fled into the street. I checked into a cheap hotel, my pulse racing, and called the police. They listened politely, but when I explained, they said, "He hasn't technically broken any laws. Strange wasn't illegal. They suggested mediation. I hung up. A week later, I returned with police escort to gather my things. The loft felt hollow, stripped of warmth. Ethan's room was empty. No suitcase. No trace he'd ever been there. Except for what I knew. The photographs. The moments stolen. 2 years passed. Toronto became survivable again, though never home. I rebuilt a career, took commercial gigs, saw Sophie sometimes, though distance grew. Then, during a shoot, I saw his name on a news alert. Ethan Blackwood, arrested for stalking, burglary, photographs taken of roommates in their sleep. My stomach turned cold. My fear hadn't been madness. It had been truth waiting for proof. But knowledge isn't comfort. At night I still check my windows, certain I'll see him on the street below, camera raised. Sometimes when the city falls into that strange, too long silence, I feel him near, recording, watching, capturing me again. Because the most dangerous people are never the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who look like anyone at all. The ones you let in. The ones who vanish, but never leave. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see it. The lens, gleaming, unblinking, still pointed at me. The city of Edinburgh in late autumn is a symphony of gray stone and sharp, cold winds, and for the past 6 years, it had been my sanctuary. My small one-bedroom flat on a quiet cobbled street in Newtown was my fortress against the world, a place where the only chaos was my own. I lived behind thick walls, the muted sound of footsteps on the pavement outside fading into the hum of my radiator, and for a time, I convinced myself I had found safety there. But safety is a fragile thing, as brittle as the crisp yellow leaves that scatter across the pavements in October. And mine crumbled the moment my landlord slid that thin white envelope under my door. The rent increase was blunt, merciless. 2 weeks to decide, find more money, or pack up what little I owned and go. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the dread curling at the base of my stomach. I had nowhere else to go, and no one I could lean on. My life was already pared down to bare essentials, and the thought of giving up the only place I could breathe was unthinkable. I stared at that letter for hours, turning it over in my hands as though its meaning might change if I tilted it toward the light. By the third day, I found myself scrolling through online listings late into the night, the pale glow of my laptop making my flat feel colder. That's when I saw the ad. A flatmate wanted, Victorian Terrace on Fetz Avenue. Rent so low it looked like a mistake. A single photograph of a living room washed in sunlight, a fireplace framed by cracked tiles, bookshelves sagging with forgotten paperbacks. The kind of room that seemed to hold warmth even when empty. It didn't feel real. My pulse quickened, not with excitement, but with something darker. A note of suspicion I swallowed down because desperation has its own gravity. My name is Liam, and I've never been good at sharing space. That wasn't some relic of college roommate drama or petty arguments about dishes. It was deeper, messier. My last serious relationship had gutted me in ways I still couldn't articulate. Sarah left me drained, emotionally, financially, hollow in a way I didn't recognize until I heard myself laugh one day and realized it didn't sound like me. Since then, I'd sworn off cohabitation in all its forms. Living alone was the only way I could control the edges of my life, the only way to keep the pieces together. But standing at the cliff edge of eviction, I told myself I could manage one compromise. A flatmate wasn't a partner. I could keep my distance. I could build invisible walls, even in a shared space. Marcus answered the door the afternoon I went to see the place. Early 40s, tall but not imposing, with a stillness that was difficult to pin down. His hair was dark, shot through with strands of gray, and his eyes, slate-colored, watchful, seemed to weigh me without judgment. He didn't offer the forced cheer of a landlord or the casual banter of someone eager to fill a room. He just stepped back quietly and let me in. The air in the flat was cool, tinged with the faint metallic tang of old radiators. The ceilings were high, the molding ornate but chipped, the kind of detail that hinted at history too long to contain in a listing. Something about the space felt paused, as though the house itself was holding its breath. We spoke briefly. He was a freelance writer working from home. He needed help with rent, nothing more. His tone was calm, clipped, not unfriendly but restrained, as though every word was measured before release. I signed the agreement that evening. The first few weeks were unremarkable. We passed each other in the kitchen, exchanged polite nods in the hallway. I learned he drank tea at odd hours, his mug always leaving faint rings on the counter no matter how many times I wiped it down. He learned, I suppose, that I kept irregular hours, sometimes clicking away at design projects until the early morning. For a while, the quiet suited me. I almost convinced myself I'd stumbled into an arrangement that might work. Then things shifted. At first it was small, innocuous. A book I'd left on my desk appeared angled slightly differently the next morning, the spine no longer aligned with the edge. The kitchen tap would be dripping when I was certain I'd tightened it. Once I returned from work to find my bedroom door ajar, though I was meticulous about locking it. None of these were dramatic enough to confront Marcus over, but each planted a seed, and seeds grow in silence. The nights became harder. One in particular remains etched into me like a scar. Rain slicked against the windows, the kind of steady drizzle that numbs the city in dull gray. I woke at 3 a.m. to a sound. At first I thought it was the branches outside brushing the glass, but no. The rhythm was wrong. A faint scratching, deliberate, coming from the wall directly behind my bed. It was subtle, like fingernails dragging over plaster, steady and patient. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound persisted. Not frantic, not random. Purposeful. In the morning, bleary-eyed, I mentioned it to Marcus as he poured tea in the kitchen. He gave me a thin smile, humorless, almost pitying. "Old pipes," he said softly. "When the temperature drops, they complain. You'll get used to it." His calm dismissal didn't soothe me. It unsettled me more, because I knew the difference between pipes and whatever that was. The scratching didn't stop. Each night it grew bolder, as though emboldened by my silence. I started sleeping with the lamp on, headphones pressed in with music loud enough to hurt. Still, beneath it I could sometimes hear it, the clawing insistence in the walls. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening. I returned from work to find Marcus not on the couch where he usually sat, but on the floor of the living room. The lights were off, the curtains drawn, the only illumination the faint orange glow from the street lamp outside. He was seated cross-legged, his back straight, staring at the blank wall opposite. I froze in the doorway, unsure whether to speak. When I did, my voice sounded foreign in the stillness. "Marcus?" No reaction. Not a blink, not a shift. I stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath me. I reached out, hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder. The instant I touched him, his head snapped toward me with such force I flinched. His eyes were wide, unfocused, and in that hollow gaze I felt something tighten in my chest. His lips parted, and his voice came out thin, brittle like paper tearing. "They're here," he whispered. "Can you hear them?" I recoiled, my heart hammering. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to run, but my legs carried me back to my room. I slammed the door, shoved the oak dresser against it, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the wood. Silence stretched. Then came a sound I will never forget. The scrape of wood against wood, the dresser inching forward from the other side. I shouted his name, desperate, and the sound stopped abruptly. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn came, pale light filtering through the curtains, I found my door ajar. The dresser, my heavy, immovable dresser, had been shifted several inches. Marcus was gone, the flat eerily still. I packed a bag and left. No notice, no explanation. I walked out into the cold morning air and didn't look back. It was weeks before I could bring myself to check the news. Scrolling absently one evening, I stopped cold at a headline. Family of 3 missing for 7 years found buried in Newtown flat. The photograph accompanying the article froze my blood. A Victorian terrace on Fetz Avenue. My building. The details were sparse. The bodies discovered behind a sealed wall, a man, a woman, a child. Suffocation suspected. The rent. The metallic smell I'd dismissed. The scratching in the walls. Marcus staring into nothing with eyes emptied of self. My stomach turned as the pieces assembled into something unbearable. He hadn't been a victim of the house's secret. He was part of it. Now, months later, I've tried to build something resembling normalcy again. A smaller flat, further from the city center. Cheaper, noisier, the kind of place that makes me feel invisible. Yet even here, I can't shake it. On windy nights when the air rushes through the cracks of the old window frame, I hear it. Faint whispers threaded through the howl. Sometimes I wake certain that my door has been left open again, though I remember locking it. Sometimes I catch the reflection of eyes, slate gray, watchful in the dark glass of my laptop screen. The past is never buried. It waits in the walls. It waits in silence. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel the weight of that dresser shifting inch by inch toward me.